Okay, that should be on now. Okay, so I'm Josh Rakita. I work at the Sam Houston Memorial Museum in Huntsville, Texas. I've been working there for about 3.5 years now. So I'm going to school to be a history major. I'll graduate up here in May. So after that, I'm hoping to go work with Jordan Goodwin. He's actually in the presentation tonight. He's out of Tennessee. He runs Axe and Anvil Handworks. So he does a lot of 18th century ironwork and things like that. So I'm real excited to hopefully go work with him here relatively soon. This past summer, I had an
Oh,
intern. What was that? Okay. This past summer, I had an internship at Colonial Williamsburg. So I got quite a bit of experience doing that. And so a lot of this presentation, a lot of it is based off of the principles I learned there. So this presentation really is more about material culture than blacksmithing or using blacksmithing to interpret material culture. So what material culture is are physical objects that are produced, used, and left by a people group. They're objects that impact the culture. So, you might think of like religious symbols, but it can even be agricultural implements, hardware they have on their homes, the clothes they're wearing, the foods they're eating, things like that. And they tell us a lot about a culture's ideas, values, needs, wants, beliefs, things like that. Um, they also prove societal relations and technological achievements. So a good example of this is at the Sam Houston Museum. During the archaeology, we found pottery fragments or china fragments that said made in England. So that's showing a direct result of trade between England and Texas in the 1840s, whether that is directly or if it's, stopping in New York and going to New Orleans and Galveston and then Huntsville. It also increases the perception of realness of abstract ideas and facts. So later we're going to talk about nail making. I often tell people, a nail maker can make 2,300 nails in a day. Well, if you're studying material culture and you're demonstrating making a nail, they're going to be much more aware of how much work went into 2,300 nails rather than just given the facts and reading the ideas or something like that. They also back up historical written and oral records. And I'll show an example here, a couple examples actually of written text, and then by examining the material culture, we can find the evidence for that. And then lastly, it helps us appreciate and make decisions in our modern material culture. Some of the principles of 18th century ironworking, I truly think can help us solve climate problems and resource sustainability, things like that. And we'll get to that here in a little bit. So the basis or the overview of what this presentation is going to be is mainly common questions and misconceptions asked by visitors, since it is directed to museum staff. So these are just some of the ones that we get often. What is a blacksmith? Blacksmiths make everything people needed. What do they make? Blacksmiths make iron. Cast iron and wrought iron are the same thing. They didn't have steel back then. And what are the tools of a blacksmith? So first we'll talk about what is a blacksmith. The word blacksmith literally means someone who works with the black metals, which are iron and steel. And that's because whenever you're working and heating iron, it instantly rusts in the fire, and in the absence of moisture, that rust turns black. And then smith comes from the word to smite or to hit with a hammer. There's many different types of smiths: gunsmiths, coppersmiths, silversmiths. So just about anybody with a smith in their title is using a hammer to some degree. And then it also means that they're a generalist. So the fact that they're not a locksmith or a gunsmith means that they're doing a very broad range of things. Day to day, they're never, making the same exact thing. They're never holding stock, so they're not going to make 10 hammers and hope people come and buy them. They're going to be working on an as-needed commission basis. And so in a local community, what that looks like is repair and custom work, mainly for agricultural implements, hardware for the homes, maybe some repair on cooking utensils and things like that. This newspaper article or advertisement here came from Huntsville newspaper in 1849, and I just really like this phrase here. He says he's well prepared to do all kinds of work in his line with the utmost dispatch and in a manner satisfactory to all. So I just think that's kind of a cool, you know, reveals kind of his mentality behind the work and how he's trying to get business. So what is the difference between an iron founder and a blacksmith? Often people think that I'm going to be melting and casting metal. So the main difference is they're completely different materials. So the carbon content in cast iron is much higher, around 4 to 5%, while wrought iron has between like 0.01 and 0.02%. So a lot less carbon. What that added carbon does is it makes it very brittle, which is why cast iron is very heavy when you're working with it, because they're sacrificing weight for strength. The techniques, of course, are different. Forging is the term that a blacksmith uses. That's changing the cross section of a solid bar of steel or iron. And then the cast iron, of course, you see in the picture on the right, they're literally melting that and pouring it into a mold. The products are generally very different. So you're not going to be making, for most of history, you're not going to be making like cooking utensils out of cast iron. You're not going to be making a lot of tools out of cast iron. Once you get into the 19th century, really the mid 1840s and 50s, cast iron becomes a lot more efficient of a process. So they capitalize on that. And you do see a transition from blacksmith work being adopted by foundrymen. And then the last, of course, liquid versus solid. I guess we just talked about that. Next question is, what did blacksmiths slash ironworkers make and repair? So kitchen utensils, these are, on these frames here, these are a series of reproductions and originals that I own myself. So you see, quite an array of trivets up here, slices, peels, shovels, spoons, forks, spatulas, S-hooks, things like that, and a lot of others. So now we're going to look at some specific examples. These are reproductions here. These are flesh forks. So this style is probably 18th to early 19th century. They're rather long. They're normally about 2 to 2.5 feet long, because you're cooking meat over a hearth, so you have to bend down to reach. Kitchen utensils are normally filed bright, so you can see that top one, that's basically brand new. Almost the entire surface has been filed, taking off any of that scale. I think what that does is it shows that we have similar values today of cleanliness as they did. So because kitchen utensils are filed bright, they kind of look like our stainless steel today. So if you go into a kitchen, a lot of people like stainless steel sinks, dishwashers, countertops, things like that. So this is an original example of a cooking spoon, also probably 18th or 19th century. Items like these are very commonly commercially made and imported, and very easily purchased for cheap at the local store. This one has some decorative stamping on the handle, and there'll be a closer look at that in the next slide. And you can see even after 200 years, there's quite a that bright surface is still there, which is pretty cool. And then when they're decorated a lot and they have dates, that often means that they were given as gifts or wedding presents. Not all the time, but that does indicate that they're probably going to be made local if you can find ones with dates like that. So there's kind of a closer up view of the stamping. This is an original spatula that I found actually here in Huntsville. I found it at an antique shop. I don't think it's original to Huntsville, but maybe to Texas. And I think this one is mid to late 19th century. What you'll notice about it, and I'll give you a closer up look here in a bit, but there is firework here in the center, and there's a ridge that's going along this handle. So that handle is a half round, basically a sphere cut in half. Um, and what that ridge is indicating is that they did not file the whole thing bright, like we had talked about earlier. Um, I had sent an email recently to the master blacksmith at Williamsburg, and I asked this question of why would they do this? And he says in the mid to late 19th century, you often see swaged handles being planished. Planished just means um, basically all the surface is taken at a low heat and trying to get out any hammer marks or scale that is there because they're trying to cut out as much time as they can in the finish work. Believe it or not, on that cooking fork, that probably took me about an hour and a half to forge, but the file work probably took me at least twice or three times as long on that. So if they can cut that out, they're going to do that. So that's a good example of that. This is a swage right here. You can see that half round. So you would just put that handle in upside down and then hammer it flat, and it'd give you that half round shape. And there's kind of a closer look. You can see some decorative file work there. So they're still trying to make it appealing, yet they're still trying to go as quickly as possible. So the next category is hardware. Things like, door handles, hasps, bolts, nails, hinges. So this is an original hasp that I found at a local antique show. It's used to lock and secure doors. So in the center here would be a staple. Then you can put a stick or a lock or something like that. This one's very large. This is kind of an observation I made that it probably went on a rather large door. And these chiseled lines here is a very popular decorative style for Spanish iron. So it's possibly Spanish in origin. I would assume it's very early. So I would want to say 17th or 18th century, but I don't really know that. And it's most likely imported. So this is not a trade that is really being manufactured here on a large scale. So I would assume this is probably going to be imported if it's very early. Here's another original Spanish ironwork. This is a sliding bolt on a Spanish church door. It's located at a local museum, the Star of the Republic Museum at Washington on the Brazos. And it's rather ornate. It's a very nice forging, and so it's showing where the money is. Often in Europe, you see that the church and the state are the largest patrons of this decorative stylized ironwork. So the fact that it is very clean, it's on a church door, it adds to that kind of analysis that the church is really what's funding a good portion of the economy. If you can find original doors, often they still have original hardware. Same thing with furniture pieces. If you can find those, there's normally a good bit of iron or metal work on theirs. And again, I kind of doubt that this is going to be domestically made, just because of its nice forging and the type of work that it is. So next is going to be tools. At this time in the 19th century, there's a phrase called "by these hands all trades to stand." And what it means is that by a blacksmith, all the iron and metal tools that every trade uses comes from them. So hammers, saws, tongs, calipers, pliers, things like that. So very, very important trade. So this is a reproduction forging hammer that I made. It's reproduced from an 1830s salesman catalog. I can't remember the name. I think it's Tools for the Victorian Trades and Crafts. I meant to include that. But if you look real closely right here, you'll see a line. On the front, there's some dark metal, and in the back, it's lighter. So that's indicating a forge weld of steel to iron. So a body of iron in a face of steel. And the reason that they're doing that is because steel is about twice as expensive as iron is at the time. If you look down here, this is another Houston-based newspaper from the 1841, and they're giving current prices of steel and iron. Steel's being sold at about 10 to 17 cents a pound. Iron, you can see where it's coming from, Sweden, England, or America. Um, that's being sold at between 5 and 8 cents a pound. So it could be a good 2, 3 times as expensive. So they're going to try to capitalize on how cheaply they can make that. Again, this is going to be something that is very easily imported, and just like going to a local store today and purchasing a claw hammer. These are original quilting frame clamps, probably from the 18th to 19th century. They're probably bought, sold, and used in a set of 4. I don't know if y'all are familiar with quilting, but one of the ways they do it or support the quilt is they take 4 poles and they clamp them together. So it's very rare to find 2 objects made by the same hand, or in this case, maybe the same manufacturing. But it shows us product consistency standards by the maker and user at the time. So on first glance, they look, like a matching set. But if you look very closely, you can tell the one on the left is much bigger. It's wider there, and the tabs there on the screws aren't very similar at all. The holes are even different sizes. So that's just kind of a neat thing that we can analyze. Something that's probably rather cheaply made. These are original and reproduced dividers. So the divider in the center was made by Broadus Thompson at Williamsburg. Then the 2 on either side are original pieces. These are also show up in that Tools for the Victorian Trades and Crafts book from the 1830s. They're mainly used as measuring tools in many, many trades, again, commercially made. And they show us popular industry-wide styles, just like claw hammers today, again. This one in the center or on the right side has a maker's mark there, and that often is an indication of commercial manufacture. Local blacksmiths very seldom ever stamp their work. So the last category is agriculture, implements, and transportation. I lumped these together. They could be their own category, but this is what I see most advertisements for Texas blacksmiths of what they're offering work to do. So this is a original plow attributed to Joshua Houston. Joshua Houston was one of Sam Houston's slaves there on his farm. In addition to a lot of many duties that he did, he was also their blacksmith. So a lot of repair work on agricultural tools. He was a farrier, so he was shoeing horses, probably repairing a lot of tools and things like that as well. The blade here is really what they say is attributed to Joshua in the museum. It's built up from multiple pieces, which is kind of neat. The next slide will have a closer view of that. This could have been imported, made in Texas, or completely made by Joshua. I just don't really know. I see many advertisements for plow makers in Texas. There's many that could be imported very easily. And you see that on newspaper advertisements as well. And this one's located at the Sam Houston Memorial Museum. So you can see kind of the back there. There's a piece of steel that's welded right here. This 90-degree corner, those of y'all who are blacksmiths know that would be a very, very difficult forging to accomplish. So that's also a forge weld. There's a couple pieces in here that's attaching it to this upright. And then a punched hole that's also welded on. So this is an original ox yoke. Staple, it goes in the center of an ox yoke, and that basically is the trailer hitch of the 19th century. This one was also found local. I would assume that it was used local as well, and it was made local because it is a rather crude item. It's something that would probably wear out pretty often. And need to be replaced. If you look up here on the top, the wedge piece is very similar to the thumb piece of a thumb latch, and I'll show you a closer view of a thumb latch later on. So I don't know if that actually is a thumb latch piece that they just had lying around, or it was a familiar forging for them. But what you'll notice is they had to use a lot smaller of a bar doing it this way than if they started from a larger bar and try to get full contact all the way around. Another neat thing about the ring here is there's one weld right there, and there's a second weld in the back. What's that showing is that they're reusing scrap iron. And because of the high cost in iron, they're willing to put that extra work to weld scraps together to then make their finished product. That right there is one of the reasons why I think um, this mentality could solve a lot of our material problems. Today, things are often cut out or machined off. If you can forge your product as close as possible and reuse that material, that's going to save a lot of that material. So sources of iron in Texas. People often ask, where's our iron coming from? So these are all from the same newspaper. Again, Texas Telegraph and Register in 1841. Um, this is that price list again, talking about Sweden, England, and America. I also wanted to point out here on the right, if you look on this left column, they're advertising a lot of finished goods. So 100,000 cut tacks of assorted sizes, 12 dozen knives and forks, 1 dozen long-handed shovels, 12 dozen door and window bolts, 20 dozen handsaw files, 10 dozen cut and mill saws, 10 pit saws, 40 kegs of nails, grubbing hose, painted pails, and Carolina hose. So a lot of these finished goods are being manufactured elsewhere and being imported into Texas. So Texas's first iron manufacture comes about in 1847. It's called Nash's Iron Foundry. It's about 25 miles northwest of Marshall, Texas, which is where the conference is being held. And they're using local ores, so they're not importing ore. It was used by the Confederate government again during the Civil War for manufacture of arms. And by the 1860s, it's traded hands multiple times, eventually sold to the Kelly Plow Company, which is a very big name in plows at that time. And it possibly manufactured Texas's first wrought iron. So this newspaper article from 1857 says, the Gazette states that on the 12th, Mr. Nash's iron forge commenced work at Jefferson and threw out several bars of wrought iron made from ore obtained from his iron mountain. So I don't know how common it was for them to be doing this. Maybe this was just a one-off, but that is a pretty neat thing to see. So the process of iron manufacture, just briefly, here on the left is a 19th century blast furnace. So what they'll do is they'll build a large stone structure and they'll set a fire in there. And through this kind of covered awning there, they will dump charges of powderized iron and charcoal. And they'll let that burn for several days. And it'll get to a liquid state and it will pour out the bottom into these troughs here. And then it'll solidify. If you've ever heard of pig iron, that's where that comes from because it looks like piglets suckling on a sow. So from there, that pig iron is essentially cast iron. So they have to heat it up again in what's called a finery forge, burning all of the carbon out of it or most of the carbon out of it. And then they will, if you've ever seen taffy being made, it's a very similar process, but they will hammer it out. They'll stack it on each other. They'll weld it. They'll cut it, fold it, weld it, cut it, fold it, weld it several times. And then they'll have a finished bar of iron. So if you look here in this photo, this is a much, much later photo, but I like it because you can see the stacks of iron on there. It's very, very easy to see. So because of that stacking, folding, and welding, you get a grain structure that's very similar to wood grain. It's very long fibers, and the purpose of stretching the iron that much is to cause the bar to be more homogeneous. So trying to make it as consistent throughout, as strong throughout. And what this does is it causes a lot of strength along the grain, but against the grain, it's very, very brittle. So that's going to inform a lot of the ways that you're going to make things at that time. So instead of just punching a hole, oftentimes you'll see something wrapped and welded to make a hole or an eyelet. So when you're doing reproduction work, you need to be conscious of that and taking the same steps that they had, so you can make an accurate reproduction. And again, the abilities affect the shape of the final product. So this is a source of iron for Sam and Joshua Houston. We'll start down here at the Gibbs ledgers. The Gibbs brothers owned a general store in Huntsville at that time. And you can see on on a date in May, they bought 15 pounds of iron right here for $1.35. That comes out to about 9 cents a pound. Well, I was able to find in Galveston a price listing from just a few months earlier. You can see their iron, English refined, they're buying it for 5 to 5.5 cents a pound. Swedish, 5.5 to 6.5. Hoop iron, sheet iron, those are all a little bit more expensive. And then nail rods are 6 to 9 cents a pound. So by the time it gets from Galveston to Trinity and then to Huntsville and then to the Houstons, the price has been marked up a little bit. So it's kind of on par with what you'd expect there. Then on the right, that's an advertisement from the Gibbs brothers that they have iron, cast steel, German steel, and hoop iron in stock. All right, so some of the effects of the Industrial Revolution. The use of machines to forge and manufacture ironwork quickens the process, and it gives you more consistent products. They're also going to be starting with more consistent starting stocks, which is important in reproduction work to find the correct starting stock. So in the 18th century, if you're doing something like that, it could be kind of up in the air. Maybe they started from a really large bar because that's all they had and worked it down. Maybe they started from a square bar, round bar. You don't really know. But it's going to be much more obvious in the 19th century what that starting stock is. It's also going to cause less skill to be involved in the process. So the 18th century is really the height of hand craftsmanship. And then with the introduction of tools, it's much more automated. You're also going to need more capital to start up, which is something that was always a struggle in the metalworking trade. That's why you often see family businesses in the metalworking trades because they can, will their tools on to their heirs. But in industrial revolutions can take a lot more money to make things. Interchangeable parts cut out the generalist. So to some degree, the blacksmith is going to lose out on being that repair guy. If you could order in a part or just buy a new one for cheaper, you're going to start to see that kind of price relationship change. Like I said earlier, you'll see cast iron being used more frequently. And as material becomes cheaper, the labor and material cost dynamic changes. And as technologies advance, blacksmiths are going to find new courses of work. So the first automobile mechanics are going to be blacksmiths, just because they have the tools and the knowledge to work on that material. They've already been in the transportation trade as far as wagons and horses go. And a lot of this is adapted from Peter Ross's machine mentality lecture. He had identified 4 things that were different from the 18th century to 19th century, and they follow these principles here. So I want to show you all an example of this actually happening. So the hacksaw on the bottom is an 18th century style hacksaw. That's one that I reproduced in Colonial Williamsburg this summer. But you can see, the starting stock here is much different than the ones right here. This whole frame is one piece. So I had to start from a larger bar and work it down. On top here, this kind of bow piece is separate from these 2 boxes on either end that hold the pins. So this cross piece up here that easily could be bent, that's going to be your starting stock. It's consistent all the way throughout. This piece was probably cut and machined, and really there was no forging necessary on this piece. Then they get brazed in at the end. Same thing with door latches. The one on the left is called a Suffolk latch. That is another 18th century piece. The starting stock is 1/4 by 1 or somewhere in that ballpark. So you can tell nothing on that latch looks 1/4 by 1 inch. So every single space on that latch has been forged and changed. This one on the right is called a Norfolk latch, and this is what you'd probably see between 1800 and 1840s. You can see, you've got some sheet metal right here. Again, this cusp, this grasp, is just a piece of 3/8 bar that's been folded over. Additionally, what you can tell is this finial on top is the reverse of this finial on the bottom. So what they would do is they would feed the sheet iron into a machine that would just stamp it out. And in one motion, you have the top and the bottom cut for a handle. And this is a cast iron latch. We're talking about cast iron replacing things that would be made by an iron worker. So this comes about 1845, and you see these for a very long time after that. You can still purchase these that look basically exactly the same. So some tips for doing reproduction work. The first is evidence of the process is going to show up in the work. So on initial examination, you're going to want to look for tool marks anywhere where the metal transitions in thicknesses, seams, welds, cracks, and wear patterns are also going to tell you how this thing was used. Also use as many originals as possible. If you work for a museum, you might have access to some. Normally don't take them into the shop if you can help it. Take really good measurements and make a drawing first. And know that the tendency is to make too thick and heavy than what they did in the past if working off of a drawing. Also know what you're trying to reproduce. So there's several things you can try to reproduce. One is the object. So the physical object itself, the style. So if you're just going for something that generally could have looked as if it existed back then. And then the third thing would be the quote, the workmanlike manner. So if you're reproducing an object, you're trying to get it within a 1/16 of an inch, you're going to, take a lot more time being detailed, taking extra heats, filing a little bit more than if you were just forging as quickly as they could to try to make a living. So that's kind of the difference there. So know what you're trying to reproduce. If you're in a museum setting, you don't need an exact reproduction. I think the workmanlike manner is just about the best way to go, so people can get an accurate portrayal of what's going on and what they looked like at the day. Now, you do have to note, I think, that we can never be as good as they are unless we're working on only Suffolk latch or Suffolk latches our entire career. We also don't go through formal apprenticeships today. So our portrayal of them working is going to be reasonably behind their skill level, which is fine. I just think we also need to make guests aware of that. So I want to look at a specific reproduction that I did. This is a cooking trivet that, this is an original right here that I was trying to reproduce at Colonial Williamsburg. On first examination, what I note is some welds here in this area that indicates that the handle is one piece and then the ring is another. You also note a considerable amount of fire damage right here, and we'll get back to that here in just a second. Also note that this circle where this meets this handle is higher up than this handle or this transition area right there. So these are some pictures I have of me making it. You can tell it was filed bright at one point. Quite a bit of that went into the handle. Then there's me making the ring there. And this is just a video of me forge welding the trivet. If you think about that time period also, about the work days as well. We think the work week is 40 hours, 5 days. So this is the finished product here. You can see on the right-hand side, that's all my notes and measurements that I took off the original. And I wanted to look at a couple things. So this transition area that I mentioned before, the same exact spot, this comes in a little bit farther up the handle than this one. I also noticed that fire damage on the center of that finial there. Well, I've got fire damage all up and down the same thing. So what it tells me is a couple things. One, I need to be a little bit better if my goal is to make this perfect. But two, I probably went through the same process that they did because my mistakes are showing up in the same area, which I thought was a pretty neat thing. And then full disclosure, my finished product turned out about a quarter inch behind or over the original, so it wasn't exactly right. So interpreting in the forge, this is me making a nail again at Williamsburg. I just wanted to show you, how much information you can give them about a nail. A nail is something that's very easy to study, and everybody knows it. And within a minute or so, you can give out a souvenir. So people really like that. So nailsmiths or nailers can make up to 2,300 nails in a day. A general blacksmith can make around 800. So there's the difference between nail makers and general blacksmiths. The first nail making machine was made in 1795 by Jacob Perkins. And they're using what's called cut nails. And we'll show you that here just in a second. By the 1840s, the cut nails were extremely common and very, very cheap. But these machines can make nails up to 6 times faster than the nailsmiths. So you see why they're going to start overtaking just your normal nail. This is the heading process right here. So in about a minute, you've got a finished nail. Now, these would be called wrought nails, and they still have certain applications. And we'll get to that in just a second. But why wrought nails versus cut nails? This is how the cut nails are being manufactured. So you have these little slivers of iron, and then they get put in a nail header, and they get hammered down to create the head. At some point, they also create the machine that can do it themselves. So if y'all remember back to the grain structure of wrought iron, you'll remember that the grain is going this way. So that means on a nail, the shear plane is across the nail, which is not the best as far as structural integrity goes. So here on the right-hand side, there's a cut nail. On the left, there's a wrought nail. And where you see wrought nails show up most of the time in the 19th century is for horseshoes. Because if you get a sliver or a nail that cuts off in a horse's hoof, you could very easily lame the horse, and then your client is out a horse. So that's where you see most of the wrought nails happening and being sold. Here in this advertisement, you'll see a cask of horseshoe nails and then 100 kegs of nails assorted. I've also seen wrought nails being advertised apart from horseshoes, but that's just one of the ones that they're using. So things to consider when setting up a blacksmith shop. I get the feeling that maybe some of these historians would like to set up a blacksmith shop on their site. So here's some questions you should ask. What is my site's time period? And try your best to stick within that time frame. What does my site have, or does my site have research materials that can help? So like I was using the Gibbs ledgers that we have, those newspaper articles I found online, but there should be some things hopefully that can help you determine some of these other questions. Was there even a blacksmith on my site? It's not necessary for you to have a blacksmith historically on your site for you to have one. A great example of this would be Barrington Plantation, Washington on the Brazos. This is a setup that they put together, and they had a Washington, Texas blacksmith, but they didn't have one for their site there. So they will talk about that and say, this site was not making their own iron. This farm would not be self-sufficient, and this is where they would go to. What type of ironwork was being consumed by the site and its surrounding area? Where's my site sourcing their ironwork? Who was doing that ironwork? And do we have the space to set up a shop safely? And do we have a budget to commit? A lot of these tools are not very, very cheap at all. And so it's best to use historic tooling, which might be even more expensive. And I do think that that is a very, very important part of having a museum blacksmith shop, because these shapes and this style cannot be made on tools and using tools that aren't historically correct, which is a pretty big thing in this kind of reproduction work. So here's another shop at Colonial Williamsburg. This I included for the safety aspect. You'll see here on the left-hand side, they've got a plexiglass shield. That's perfectly acceptable if you need to do that. Of course, not preferred, but if that's all you can do, then that's what should be done. Then lastly, I want to go over just what some blacksmith shops might look like in Texas at the time. So this is pre-1830s, when Texas was still in control by Spain and then later Mexico. You'll see these bellows here look a little bit different. This anvil is hornless. You'll see that pretty often, but on Spanish anvils, they do have horns from time to time. These are some pictures from 1820s to 1890s. I wanted to note that Prittler holes on anvils generally show up around 1830. The Prittler hole is this round hole back here at the foot of the anvil. You'll see here at the Williamsburg shop, they don't have a Prittler hole because it's a little bit earlier than their time period. This one on the left, I wanted to show a kind of a cool traveling forge. This is 1864 in Petersburg during the Civil War. Then here on the right, you can see very clearly the blacksmith and wheelwright. So they're kind of merged. This is 1880 in the Williamson Museum at Lampasas. And then 1875 to early 20th century, you'll see behind the smith is a forge blower. Those come about really in common use around 1875 and later. So if you're at a site that's 1840s and you're using a crank blower, you might want to seriously consider making a bellows. The bellows that is being used at Washington on the Brazos, they made themselves. You'll also note that this anvil here is a lot leaner and longer than the old ones. So that's another way you can kind of look at your anvil and evaluate your shop. And lastly, here on the left, you'll see a tire bender. So he's in carriage work. He's got horseshoes there. So he's a farrier as well. So this smith's doing a great deal of generalized work. And this is kind of a cool shot. This is from Slayton, Texas in the 1920s. You'll see several trip power hammers there on line shafts. So that technology is pretty readily available at that time. You also see another blower right here, but this one is electric. And then you also see a light bulb right there, which I thought was kind of neat. So does anybody have any questions about the presentation?
I thought it was pretty thoroughly done. I very well done. I'm really pleased with it. I don't have any specific questions other than at one point I had a blacksmith specific question on one of your projects, but I don't remember what it was. A technique question. But yeah, overall, I really enjoyed it.
I can kind of click back through here and see if you see anything.
I remember what it was. It was about the hacksaw that you made.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I don't know. I don't want to take up anybody's time because this is very specific to blacksmithing.
That's okay. Go ahead and ask.
I mean, it's on my bucket list to make at some point, but God only knows when. Is the bottom half near the handle split, like the lower, smaller section that meets the blade? Is that chiseled off from the main bar, or is it bent around and welded together to create the tang?
Yeah, so I've tried it both ways before. The welding didn't go very well, but I'm not going to say that they were never welded ever. Uh, Jordan can comment if he's ever seen any that were welded. Um, but
So it's probably chiseled.
the one that I did was indeed chiseled, and I started
Okay.
from 3/4 inch square. I probably should have started even a little bit thicker.
Huh.
But then once you get that barb that comes down, then you cut that slot in for the blade to go in.
Huh. Okay. I've never looked at one like in person. I've only seen photos of, the one you did and, a few from Williamsburg. And I thought that was a fascinating project to consider for the future.
Yeah, it definitely is a very, very cool project, and it was also on my bucket list to make one. Any other questions or responses on how y'all thought it went? Any criticism, constructive criticism?
The only thing I can think of would be when you were talking over the nail making video, the hammering was a bit loud compared to your voice. It was hard to hear you, but thankfully what you were saying was already written down for us to see.
Okay. Yeah, I had wondered about that. And I think over Zoom, that will be worse than in person. But yeah, I did think about that, and I do agree with that.
Is there a way of either lowering the video volume or muting it while you're talking?
I probably can. When this is being done in person, I can lower it physically on the computer. So I'll make sure I do that.
Okay, yeah, that's the only thing I can think of
Yeah,
for suggestions.
that's a great point.
Where are you going to do your presentation from your house there again, or?
No, the presentation is going to be at the Texas Living History Association conference.
So
It's in Marshall, Texas. So it's a live in person presentation.
I see. Do they have good internet there?
I hope so.
Yeah. Yeah. The upspeed, obviously, I'm like a net admin also.
Okay.
But yeah, like the upspeed of your connection, what you could look up Zoom, but if you don't get a good upspeed, like 6 or 7 or 10 megabits, you might turn the quality setting down maybe on Zoom.
Okay.
There might be some settings you could tweak just to make sure you don't have any video interruption.
Yeah. Did you all experience any of that?
I did briefly, but it was just like one time.
Okay.
But
Well,
yeah,
that's good.
your audio kept coming through great.
Okay, that's good. I was worried. I got about halfway through, and I thought, I hope no one's trying to like text me that this video isn't working or something.
I didn't see any lag or any freezing or any issues on my end.
Good. I think there were a couple questions in the. So Jordan said that yes, he has seen some hacksaws that were part welded. Um, and then someone said, "Can you use a 4-pound rounding hammer for making or for nail making?" I would assume that's a reference to the rounding hammer that Mark is using in one of the photos, which is a historically incorrect hammer. But unfortunately, I can't convince Mark otherwise. Um, Also, with the trivet, did you rivet that leg that was on the handle? Yes. So that is called a invisible rivet or a invisible tenon. There might be a more official name for that. And I seem to be loading here. But I was going to try to go back to that picture.
Was the top of it countersunk to help make it invisible?
It was, yeah. So you countersink it, and then using a very light hammer, you can peen that over, and it will then fill in the gaps. It's kind of hard to do that. I've done it several times, and this is the best it's ever turned out. Often I have a little bit of a seam that is exposed, but this one went very beautifully, and I can't exactly tell you why it was any different than normal, other than I had several attempts in these.
What did you use to make the countersink? Like a center punch or something?
No, I actually just filed it in. They do have
Oh,
some. They do have some countersinking punches that are very, very wide and aggressive. But with this one, I just filed it in.
So I got a quick criticism on one of your slides. I think it was something like what things to look for, or tips for reproducing or something like that.
Okay.
And there wasn't quite enough of an introduction to the fact that you were talking mainly about looking at and referencing original pieces, and you kind of launched into like what to look for in original work, but didn't. And we probably all knew what you were talking about,
Yeah.
but that could be made a little bit clearer.
Okay. Yeah, I agree with that. Thank you. That is a rather sharp transition there. So I'll see what I could do, and maybe it's just a verbal thing to say in reproduction work, looking at original examples. So, thank you.
There's absolutely no better teacher than or we don't have any better teacher than the original work.
Right. Yeah. Well, awesome. I think that at 7:57, so that was right on the money. I have an hour. So with a couple questions and stuff like that, I think it'll go well. All righty. Oh, with the spoon, did you file the inside or planish? I just planished it. I don't have a good picture to reference that. But the spoon has a domed. Well, the tool you use has a dome top, and you after dishing the spoon, you hit it with a small hammer, and it'll smooth up the iron without actually taking any iron away. It'll just leave the hammer surface on the metal.
I do have a question not specific to the presentation about strap hinges. Actually, I went to an Amish store recently in Pennsylvania, and I saw what turned out to be a cast strap hinge with a decorative scroll for a candle holder, and I thought I would reproduce it using a real strap hinge. And rather than go through the trouble for a decoration to do the forge weld on the strap hinge, I did a rolled eye. My question is, how common would a rolled eye versus forge welded strap hinge, roughly door sized, be? I know I would assume they're typically forge welded, but are rolled eyes strong enough to hold a door?
Mm-hmm. I don't know particular about what is most common or how uncommon one would be, but I can tell you for a fact that you see both at the time. In the 18th century, what's more closely related to you, Moravian hinges, they always have a rolled eye. They almost never
Okay.
are rolled, which is very peculiar. Because like you, I would expect for strength they'd all be welded.
Well,
That was my concern, was the strength.
so if I can jump in a little bit, so the Moravian hinges with their rolled eye, first of all, they're not for like super ultra heavy doors. They're usually for somewhat lighter panel doors, and then also the rolled eye is fairly heavy stock, but and Moravian hinges are not really well, I guess there probably are Moravian strap hinges, but I'm thinking of the really short ones that have like a really wide like paddle that mounts to the door. But yeah, you do see rolled eyes are quite common even early on, but it's kind of a regional thing. And it tends to be true that for heavy doors or gates, welded eyes are the norm. And it's usually rolled eyes are usually only used in fairly light lighter applications where not quite as much weight is involved. So, I mean, that's been my observation, but yeah. So it's not a time period thing. It's a use specific thing.
So like household doors would be fine for rolled eyes.
Yes. Yeah. They'd be relatively common on interior doors, although welded hinges are not uncommon in light applications too. I guess what I would say is I think that the rolled eyes would be not uncommon in light applications, but would be more uncommon in heavy applications. I've never seen a heavy strap hinge or like a 3-foot strap hinge or anything or something like that with a rolled eye.
Oh, good grief, I wouldn't expect a 2 or 3 foot hinge to be rolled now.
Jordan, I've seen a couple that are rolled.
Well, from
Really?
what time?
From 18th century.
Okay, interesting.
Wow.
One of the guys at Williamsburg collects Moravian hinges. And I was over at his house and looking at all of them, and you've got some long ones that are rolled.
Cool.
Yeah.
Very cool. I stand corrected. And I also should say, if I didn't already, I meant to, that it can definitely be a regional thing too. The Moravians had a very, very fairly unique, let's put it that way, style of ironwork.
What thickness were those hinges for the rolled ones?
The ones that I saw,
Yeah.
I don't think they were more than a 1/4 inch thick.
Wow.
Maybe a little bit more, but I don't think they were very thick at all.
How tall was the barrel? Because it seems like Moravian hinges usually have a fairly short barrel.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, that they were short. I don't think the strap hinge was more than 1.25 inches wide.
If you look through, Bridget, do you have a copy of Albert Sahn's Early American Ironwork? Or Early American Wrought Iron, excuse me.
Is it a tan cover?
Yes.
I don't have one, but I have access to one at one of the museums I volunteer with. I actually have the Sorber collection on its way to me finally, but I have access to, I think, the wrought iron, the Early American book.
Yeah. So it's the edition that has all 3 volumes in one. It's a great big book, but you can look through there and there's literally hundreds of hinges, and you'll be able to see ones that, which styles of hinge have rolled barrels as opposed to welded. And there's also
Right.
a few examples, not as many as I would like, but there's a few examples of doors with the hinges on them. And the larger hinges that have rolled barrels that I remember in that book are there's usually more than 2 to a door. So like it might be a Dutch door with like 2 hinges, 2 large straps per half of the door or whatever. And anyway, so just a little bit more to that.
Cool, thank you. Door latches are actually on my bucket list a little higher up than hinges, but this decoration I saw just made me want to make one right away. So I went with the rolled eye. But yeah, thank you. I will take a closer look. I glanced through it once while I was at the museum, but I didn't pay much attention. But yeah, I'll go through it again and see what I see.
Nice.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, if there's no other questions, then I guess we can wrap up here. Thank you all for coming. I really, really appreciate it. It definitely makes me feel more prepared for this weekend. So thank you very much.
You are very welcome. Thanks for the invite.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I really enjoyed it. And I want to say that I'm just diving into using wrought iron, and the explanation you did in showing the breaking of the piece and the grain structure and everything, and how historically they would like wrap around to keep the strength of the piece and then forge weld it instead of like drifting a hole or something, was super. It's like now it seems like so obvious, but was something I had wondered about. So I really appreciate the information that you provided with that,
Yeah.
especially.
That's really cool.
Yeah, so I really enjoyed all of it, and it was really good.
Well, thank you.
Mhm.
What have you been making with the wrought iron?
I started with doing like jewelry and stuff, pendants, and the etching is so cool when you etch it. It's just so interesting. I tried making a leaf to kind of push the spreading of the material, like
Mm-hmm.
seeing how flat I could make it and drawing down the stem and stuff like that. But a ladle is on my list to try with wrought iron, which I don't know if that's a bad idea, but it's just something that I've wanted to try my hand at. I tried a ladle a while ago after seeing you and Jordan's tasting spoon.
Mm-hmm.
I got inspired by that and did a one-piece ladle, which was okay.
Nice.
But it made me want to try spoons and ladles and more traditional stuff like that
Yeah.
in
That's
steel
awesome.
and wrought iron.
So I've been wanting to also make a wrought iron spoon, and I haven't done that yet. What I've heard from people who do is they'll process wrought iron. Like a good starting stock for me would be like wagon tire. That's about all I
Mhm.
have. And generally that's pretty coarse wrought iron. It's not very refined. So they'll take like squares of it and they'll stack it on itself. So now you
Okay.
have grain running both ways.
Oh, interesting.
And then they'll weld that up and draw it out to a bar that they're going to use, and then they'll make the spoon from there. So it's a lot of hammering and pre-forging. But if you run into issues with drawing out that much of
Yeah.
wrought iron, you might try that.
That's very cool. Yeah. I'll probably start with steel.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
a good practice and a good start, but that's really interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I have like one question.
That's fine.
Historically, so like hammers, like hammer weight and like size is like a whole thing in the community, like bigger hammers or smaller hammers. Historically, by and large, what size hammer were blacksmiths using in like the 17th, 18th century?
Yeah. I don't know if I have a great answer for that. I've got a book here. I was just reading. It's Joseph Moxon's Mechanic Exercises, and he talks about hammer weight, and he says it's a hammer that's light enough to wield with one hand. So if that's not vague enough, I don't know what is.
Yeah.
But
Awesome answer.
right. So I've seen videos of nail making, and they're using a hammer that's no more than a pound and a half. I've also seen videos of nail making where they're using probably a 3-pound hammer. So I'd say probably for a general blacksmith, anywhere between the 2.5 to 3.5 pound range
Okay.
would be good. I swing a 3-pound hammer. I think that's a very good weight, at least for me. But some people have lighter ones, some people have heavier ones.
Is that head only weight or is that head and handle combined weight?
I think that's head only, if I remember
Okay.
correctly.
Josh, this is Dad.
Okay.
Sorry. I'm just curious then, based on that question, what were people using in the Anderson Forge at Williamsburg? Was it just everybody's personal preference, or were they using something that they thought was weight accurate for the time period?
Yeah, that's a good question. All I can really tell you is the first one, which is everybody's hammer was around 3 pounds. I think Mark's was a little bit heavier, or at least it felt heavier to me. I think it's probably closer to 3.5. And I would assume, given that shop standards, it would be because it's historically accurate. But I don't completely know. I actually have an original hammer, not with me, it's at work, but it's around 2.5 pounds, so it's a little bit smaller. If you, I think Jordan left, which is unfortunate because he would probably know the answer. There's some really great late 19th century and early 20th century blacksmithing manuals. And I will ask Jordan and I will let y'all know what he says. But I'm almost like certain somebody makes a comment on hammer weight in that. So I'll look into that. That's a good question.
This kind of turned into a fun blacksmith roundtable.
I know. I really enjoyed it.
Not very often you get to meet up with other museum blacksmiths.
Right. There was a guy that called me a couple weeks ago for the blacksmithing conference that I'm hosting here in a little bit with some friends. And he just unprompted by me started lamenting about how nobody in Texas does 18th century ironwork. And my mouth about dropped. So that was a cool conversation to have with him. So always a joy to meet like-minded people. All righty. Well, I guess that's a wrap. Thank y'all for coming again, and yeah, I guess I'll post this at some point whenever it gets uploaded. I'm not sure how long that'll take, but it'll get uploaded.
Cool. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, absolutely. Y'all have a good evening.
You too. Thanks a lot.
Have a good night.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think everybody left now is family. Are you still?
Oh, wait a minute.
You're
Sorry.
still recording, yes?
Oh yeah, I'll stop that.